This is Woman Being. Hello and welcome back to our April episode of season 4. We are, all three of us, at the edge of our seat with excitement for this episode today. We have a very talented and spicy guest, Kaytlin Bailey, with us today. Hello, Kaytlin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
We couldn't even express how excited we are, but we're going to introduce her in a little bit when we come back, and let's dive in.
All right.
Hey. Okay. This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds.
Without expectation or judgment,
we will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine.
So as you know, I am joined by the lovely Emma.
Hello.
And the absolutely gorgeous Kellyanne.
Salutations and thank you.
Ooh, salutations.
Whoa,
wow.
That was like an SAT word.
I know, right?
And we are joined by the stunning Kaytlin Bailey, who is a former sex worker, stand-up comedian, the founder of Old Pros, which is a nonprofit media organization advocating for the rights of sex workers in society, and the host of the Oldest Profession podcast, which features stories of sex workers from history, including some names you might recognize, like Maya Angelou, Mae West, Mary Magdalene, Lilith. There's a 2-parter on that one that I can't wait to listen to. And a whole series on the victims of the Jack the Ripper victims. Anyways, I've listened to a couple, love the podcast. If you're interested in the history of sex work and how so many influential women in society have been sex workers and their stories, check it out. But anyways, Kaytlin, welcome. Hello.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, I've been hosting the podcast since 2017. So we cover old pros from history, people who have done sex work, and also people who have been maligned as sex workers, which is a common tactic for getting all kinds of women to talk less, whether or not they've ever formally engaged in the trade.
Sounds like a witch hunt a little bit there.
Related.
Yes. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about you and what you do. I mean, I just listed a whole long list of things that you're busy with, but like, what are you up to?
So my professional background is in stand-up comedy. I spent 10 years touring the country as a stand-up comedian. I started the Oldest Profession podcast in my capacity as a stand-up comic. I came out as a sex worker in my capacity as a stand-up comic. And then I got back into politics right around 2018, after Donald Trump signed SESTA FOSTA into law, which I'm sure is something that we're going to be talking about. Like many laws, this was something that was sold to the American people as a way of protecting vulnerable women and children from exploitation. But of course, the law did no such thing. It just tried to erase the oldest profession from the internet, which we were definitely using to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah.
So when I got back into politics, I started as the founding director of communications for Decriminalizing Sex Work, which is a national advocacy organization pursuing a state-by-state strategy. So I spent about 2 years talking to state legislators on the local level. And then I started my own nonprofit media organization because it became really clear to me that we are not going to get good policy or good law changes on this unless and until we can change the story around sex work. And getting at destigmatization is absolutely critical towards working towards a decriminalized future. I do want to take a second just to take a step back and maybe like define some terms, because I feel
gosh. That was my next question. Please continue on.
I'm clairvoyant. Comes with the trade. Yeah. So sex work is a really big, broad umbrella term that refers to any kind of exchange of erotic labor for money or something of value, right? So this could include stripping or BDSM work or foot fetish modeling or phone sex operating or full service prostitution. And so there's legal sex work, there's criminalized sex work, and then there's a big broad gray area in between. And of course, people engage in sex work for money, but people also engage in sex work to get their survival needs met, for housing, food, people's basic needs. And so it's a really broad umbrella term that includes a lot of different kinds of people doing a lot of different kinds of things for a lot of different reasons. Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to understand the subtle but important legal distinctions behind all of the ways that we could regulate and control prostitution, right? Mm-hmm. So there's full criminalization, which is what we have now, right? Buying and selling sexual services is a crime in the overwhelming majority of places in the US, with the exception of some rural counties in Nevada, which have legalization or regulation, which I think is what you're talking about. Okay. Now, this is a model that doesn't benefit sex workers. It only benefits brothel owners, right? So Nevada, only state in the union with legal regulated prostitution, it has the highest arrest rate per capita for prostitution related offenses because it's impossible for people to work outside of these legally licensed brothels where they're subjected to mandatory STI tests. They have to register as a legal registered prostitute with the state of Nevada. This becomes a subpoenable of fact about you. You can imagine how this plays itself out during child custody disputes, for example. Mm-hmm. There are lots of reasons why smart, reasonable people would not want to work within the legal confines of these tightly regulated brothels. And so the overwhelming majority of sex that is sold in Nevada happens in the black market, and those people enjoy none of the legal protections, right, that are available for folks that work in the brothel. Decriminalization, which is what I and sex worker advocates all over the world are advocating for, just removes criminal penalties from having sex for money. This does not create the kind of regulatory structure. And smart people disagree about this. There's a lot of folks that want to come to sex worker rights advocacy through the lens of workers' rights and unions and advocating for workplace protections. However, we live in a society that is extremely whorephobic. And in order to be the beneficiary of any of those worker protections, you would have to identify yourself as a sex worker, right? To be a member of a protected class, to organize, to all of those things. And sex work is work, but it is also sex. And so I think that coming through to sex worker advocacy through the lens of LGBTQ advocacy gets us to a better place, right? When it stopped being a crime to be gay in the US, we didn't force people to register. We didn't force people to put themselves on an I want to do gay stuff list. We didn't make them fill out a form to do butt stuff with your buddy. We just stopped arresting people for being gay. And sex work, right? Yes, it is work. Yes, people should be treated reasonably, especially as employees or independent contractors. There's a lot of different sort of ways to figure this out. But foundationally, this is about two people negotiating consent. And if a crime isn't happening, then a crime isn't happening, right? If the sex wouldn't be criminalized, if money wasn't being exchanged, then we should definitely stop arresting people for engaging in that sex, even when money is exchanged. And this allows people to work independently. And most importantly, it creates protections for people if they're engaging in sex work to report crimes committed against them, even if they haven't registered as a business, even if they haven't filled out all of the paperwork, even if they didn't alert their landlord to the fact that they were doing this work. And there's one more model that I want to talk about. And I'm sorry, I'm self-conscious about how long this is taking. But
no, please.
Yeah. No, we want all the definitions.
And that's something called end demand, or the Nordic model. Now, this model has been around for decades. It was first enacted in Norway, Sweden, Canada, Northern Ireland. And what it does is it's sort of asymmetrical criminalization, where selling sex isn't a crime, but buying sex or facilitating sex is. This is sold. This is a policy that goes by many names. Some people call it, end demand, or the entrapment model, or the equality model, or the feminist model. But at its core, its mission is to eradicate sex work. And the people that push this law think of sex work as a crime against women, right? As not just a symbol of violence against women, but as an act of violence against women. And so it seeks to make sex work as difficult as possible to discourage both the buying and selling of sex work, believing that if they dry up demand, right, that sex workers will just go away. But that isn't how sex work works. People don't get into sex work because they heard the call of lustful men in their community. They get into sex work to make money that they need to feed their families, pay their rent, buy food. And so just making sex work harder doesn't solve any of the survival needs, and criminalizing clients makes sex work more dangerous. My very first appointment, I got on a message board, I connected to other sex workers, I posted my ad, I got emails, and I had a screening protocol where I asked people to give me their real name, where they worked, and 2 industry references. Working in a system where clients are criminalized and not sex workers, no reasonable person would give me that basic screening information, because how do they know that I'm not a police officer? And how do I know that the person who isn't giving me that information, I can't tell the difference between a nervous client and a potentially dangerous client, which is why everywhere this policy has been enacted, violence against sex workers goes up. Because asymmetrical criminalization or end-demand policies or criminalizing clients or whatever you want to call it, it reduces the negotiating power of sex workers. It drives us further underground, and it creates the vulnerabilities that lead to exploitation. Sex for money in and of itself is not exploitation. But poverty and having to run from the law and all of the cartwheels that these policies creates vulnerabilities that inevitably lead to exploitation and violence.
Thank you. That's so aptly put. So what made you go from sex work to stand-up comedy to advocacy to one-woman show? Like, you've gone the whole spectrum. Like, how did you progress through that? What was your sort of journey?
Sure. So my very first job was waiting tables. Oh, excuse me. Before that, lower than that. My very first job was being a hostess, aspiring to wait tables.
Aspiring to
I
one
worked at
day.
McDonald's. It's
I was at Applebee's. And I got into sex work really because I felt like I was being lied to about my body. I come from an upper middle class background. I had a generous allowance. I didn't have any of my survival needs or material needs that were unmet. But I'm a product of George W. Bush's abstinence-only education program, and a deeply whorephobic society that told me emphatically and over again that having sex for money was one of the worst things that a woman could do. And I just deeply suspected that wasn't true. You know, look, I became a stand-up comedian, so I definitely have a little bit of a fuck you, watch this attitude and personality. And so I felt drawn to this thing because of the stigma. And I had a relatively unscathed, pleasant, positive experience in the sex trade because of my privilege. Now, I carried all of that privilege with me into my job, as a hostess and then later waiting tables, and didn't have the same kind of negotiating power that I had as a sex worker. And so I've always been comparing and contrasting my experience as a sex worker with this overall narrative of exploitation. And that's the thing that I really want to get to. Because when people say that they want to stop sex trafficking, or when people say that they want to help vulnerable people, what they're interested in doing is reducing or eliminating exploitation, which is a noble and worthwhile goal. But unfortunately, prostitution has become a symbol of exploitation. So we end up deploying a lot of resources trying to interrupt consensual adults from having consensual sex with one another, instead of helping people in very real need across labor sectors.
That is so fascinating. Like, I love how you articulated that specifically. I felt I was being lied to about my body. And so then you're like, fuck you. I'm going to find out the truth. And the truth that you discovered is what?
The truth that I discovered is that sex for money is fine. Being exploited is gross, no matter what job that is, right? Being exploited as a canvasser is gross. Being exploited as a domestic worker is gross. I imagine, although I've never experienced, being exploited working in a mine or, working at a slaughterhouse or a processing plant. There are all kinds of manifestations of exploitation, and they're all gross, and we should all stand against them. But having sex for money, it's a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And to me, it was an avenue to connect with this long, maligned, denigrated part of myself that is actually really precious to me, which is, the sacred whore, and tapping into my sexual power and getting to play with erotic energy in an environment where I felt like I could not only articulate, but also enforce my boundaries. And those tools were not available to me during my recreational unpaid sex life. Like, I had a rough go of it in the hookup culture at college, where I felt really respected by my clients who were paying for the privilege of my company.
That's so interesting, because I think that the fact of it being a bit more blatantly transactional, it sounds like it allows for you to feel the permission to set boundaries, to say, hey, we are having an exchange of like a service and goods here. And that means that I get to write the rules here.
Right.
And rather than like, if you're in an emotional relationship with somebody that is also sexual and you have feelings and all these other things that are involved, it's a lot harder to be like, well, this is definitely the boundary, because there can be so much emotional manipulation that can happen within that of like, well, if you love me, then why wouldn't you do XYZ or whatever? Like, I can see just so much room for that to lend for emotional manipulation and a lack of control.
I mean, trying to negotiate consent under patriarchy is challenging, and it can get easier when you make implicit things explicit. And so sex work does this, BDSM negotiations do this, a lot of kink negotiations in like queer culture where they don't have this overwhelming oppressive script about what's supposed to happen, that can be really liberating. And sex work is absolutely, under that umbrella. And you just have a lot more, or I found that I had a lot more tools available to explicitly negotiate consent and advocate for myself as an escort than as a girl navigating the world.
Just a girl in the world.
Just a girl in the world.
Okay, well, what's that documentary you mentioned to me, though, about children and Nickelodeon?
Quiet on Set. Have you watched it?
Not yet. It's on my list. I know that I'm going to hate it and love it. I have to prepare myself for that kind of
there's
watch.
some dark stuff in there.
Well, it just makes me think, like, I attended a porn for purity culture dropout seminar like a couple years back. It was so incredibly like liberating.
With Erica Smith, who we've had on the podcast. She's incredible.
She's amazing.
As a porn educator.
And she brought on a guest speaker who is a porn star. And she went and sort of laid out some of the protections that are involved with like consent and what parts of her body can be touched and what parts of their body can be touched and how it's going to work and whatever. And just like the amount of like even STD testing and safety protocols and all these things that go into her profession. And it's just so sad that we have this stigmatized profession of like porn movie making that is so much safer than kids on a movie set. Like, that's terrifying.
No, it is terrifying. And it's the opposite of what we're taught, right? We're taught that we need to outlaw porn in order to protect women, right? We need to outlaw porn in order to protect children, right? When women and children are absolutely being violently and sexually exploited in all kinds of contexts, outside of the sex industry. The sex industry creates lots of protections around women and children, or really, frankly, people of all genders who participate in this work. But, there's so many more tools available for, sex workers to report abusive clients, especially when their work is decriminalized, right? For porn performers to advocate their explicit contracts. They often have, an agent or working through a producer where they get to have these conversations. And that's just not available to you, behind closed doors, or when you're somebody who is trying to navigate asymmetrical power relationships in the real world, right? Whether you're an actress talking to a director, or you're a waitress talking to a manager, there are all kinds of places out in the world where people hold power over others, and they use that power to extract, sex or other kinds of, exploitative relationships. And we should be having those conversations, but to conflate it with pornography or prostitution and to put all of that energy towards trying to eradicate the oldest profession, it does nothing to increase the negotiating power of women or children or people in vulnerable situations. And in fact, makes those people more vulnerable by pushing the entire industry underground. And we know what prohibition does to markets.
Right.
It doesn't make them safer.
Yeah.
No, definitely not. It makes me think of the fact that there's always a more real reason as to why people are trying to outlaw something like sex work. Or I think about how currently in Italy, they're trying to outlaw surrogacy. Right. And they say it's to prevent the exploitation of women, when really it's to target queer couples from having children.
Correct.
And this is another instance where a woman is using her body to provide a service and is being paid handsomely for it.
Right.
And
it's one of the only industries where women actually make more than men.
Right. Yeah. And so they're outlawing it, and they're saying it's for the protection of women, when truly it's for the oppression of queer people. And you see the same thing with marijuana or with sex work. It's all, there's an underlying thing that's happening more than what they're claiming, which is to prevent exploitation or to keep people safer, quote unquote.
And I think this is such an important message for, your listeners, especially folks that self-identify as feminist, to understand that there is a lot that is done in the name of protecting women, when what's actually happening is we are stripping women of their freedom, right? Their purchasing power, their freedom of movement, their freedom of expression, right? This is about controlling what women wear, where they go, who they associate with, and their ability to make money. And so prostitution, or specifically pornography and obscenity, has been conflated with information about contraception and information about, or acknowledgement that queer people exist, for a really long time. And I know tons of pro-choice feminist women that have dedicated huge amounts of time and energy and money to trying to outlaw or criminalize pornography, because for them, it's a symbol of violence against women. And they either don't understand or are, willfully refuse to see that they are building the tools that will inevitably be used against them and their daughters, preventing the next generation of women from being able to access basic information about our bodies by calling it obscene.
Could you also define, or maybe explain, why you choose the title "oldest profession"? What do you mean by that? How is
a lot of people might not know.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very funny. So I have a show right now called Whore's Eye View, where I cover 10,000 years, or really more than 1 million years of history from a sex worker's perspective. We scramble through the first 1 point. It doesn't matter. It's I cover a long period of time. And I ask the audience, who here has heard that prostitution is the oldest profession? And almost everyone raises their hand. And archaeologists will absolutely quibble with you about this, right? Maybe it was hunting, maybe it was midwifery, maybe it was, I had one weird person wanted to argue with me. It was actually, it was espionage. And I was like, well, that's a stretch. Who's to say? But people have heard that prostitution is the oldest profession. It is an uncensorable title. which I think is important when talking about sex or contraception or bodies, especially in the age of sort of like internet censorship that we're in right now. Lots of sex educators, historians, and sex workers are not able to, get their message or their information out to a broader audience. Again, because of these protection laws, right?
Yeah.
And I also think it's important to remind people that exchanging sex for something of value predates us as a species and certainly is older than money.
That's a great point. And actually, speaking of your show, Horror's Eye View, I'm curious to hear more about just how you've used humor and comedy to kind of break the ice in talking to people about the oldest profession and about sex work. Like, how have those two things intersected?
Well, I mean, art, media, and storytelling are really powerful levers for breaking down these entrenched beliefs, right? Prostitution is one of the most stigmatized things in our society. We, as a country, are very uncomfortable talking about sex. We're very comfortable selling sex, weirdly, like especially, for selling perfume, actually, or Coke, or, different burgers. Sex is used as a sales tool. But, anything that allows women to talk explicitly about their lived experience, especially their intimate lived experience, is stigmatized. We have been shamed into silence for very literally thousands and thousands of years. But if you can make people laugh, you can make people listen. And I think that humor and the kind of personal storytelling that I engage in sort of breaks down people's barriers. So they're not coming to this conversation as a political opponent. They're coming to this conversation, as an audience member, as somebody who is open to laughter. And if you're laughing, then you're definitely listening. And if you're laughing and listening, well, those are really important ingredients to maybe help people change their mind about something they thought they knew and understood.
Absolutely. Humor is such an incredible tool for conveying a message and for getting people to, like you said, to actually listen and let their guards down. And they're like, I think if you can make someone laugh, then you can get them to actually engage with you, which is incredible.
Well, and when is your show coming to Redding, California?
That would be really great. Sell out the Civic Auditorium,
Northern California.
We just did a show in San Francisco and LA, and we're definitely coming back to the West Coast in the fall. So,
yes.
I will be there front row.
Fantastic.
Okay, so switching gears a little bit, you've talked a little bit about how there's, this dichotomy between oppressing sex work for ulterior motives and providing advocacy for it and allowing sex workers to decriminalizing, etc. What are the tangible results that you've seen from supporting and empowering sex workers versus policing the profession?
I mean, the sex worker rights movement has come so far in the last 50 years. Just to do a really brief overview of the contemporary sex worker rights movement as we know it, sort of started in the 1970s. In 1975, 200 sex workers occupied churches all over France, starting in Lyon. And they hung a banner that said, "Our children do not want their mothers in jail," which I think is a really powerful message that still resonates today. And they started an international movement that continues today. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir was there, big name feminist. This made, national front page news or international front page news. And out of that came a lot of different sex worker led organizations really all over the world, including here in the United States, Coyote. Margot St. James founded Coyote in the early 1970s. It stands for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. And her story, I think, is really illustrative of why the sex worker rights movement is so important to the foundational rights of women. Because Margot St. James was not a sex worker. She identified as a slut and was living her best life in, the bohemian district of San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury in the 1970s. And she entertained a lot of guests of all genders, and maybe she was sleeping with some of them. And so a police officer arrested her for prostitution and forced her to undergo a terribly invasive and unsanitary STI exam, right, at the hands of some misogynistic doctor. And when they took her in front of a judge, she said, "I never turned a trick in my life." And the judge said, any woman that knows that kind of language is a professional, and convicted her on the spot. And that made her, justifiably, so angry that she ended up dedicating the rest of her life to sex worker rights advocacy, and did end up doing some prostitution to fund her advocacy in this movement. And, you know, I've heard worse fundraising ideas, frankly. So, you know, Margot St. James really set the foundation. It was one of her proteges, and my mentor, Carol Lee, coined the phrase sex work in the 1980s to push back against prohibitionist feminists who were calling us prostituted women. In the 1980s and 90s, the HIV/AIDS epidemic really changed the conversation. It became much more about harm reduction. And, you know, this is when New Zealand and New South Wales decriminalized prostitution in order to combat HIV/AIDS infections. Their governments, which, you know, work differently than ours, thought that it was wrong and dumb to prosecute people for using condoms that were being handed out by a different government agency. And so they ended up decriminalizing sex work as a public health initiative to reduce HIV infections, which they did.
Amazing.
Yeah, right? Here in the United States, Rhode Island actually sort of accidentally decriminalized indoor prostitution. It's a wild story. It's sort of a combination of judicial decision and legislative inaction. But Coyote actually sued Rhode Island for sex discrimination because both buying and selling sexual services was criminalized, but only the overwhelmingly women who were selling were being prosecuted. And so, you know, Coyote sued. A judge said, yes, this is discriminatory, and tasked the Rhode Island legislature with making it different. And in their sort of fumbled efforts to do that, they forgot to criminalize indoor prostitution. Nobody noticed this change for decades. But in 2003, there was actually a personal injury attorney who was working in the same, strip mall complex as a massage parlor that was also offering sexual services. And so one of the women that worked there, after a sting, sort of busted into his office and said, you know, I need an attorney. My friend has just been arrested. Can you help me? And he said, yes, I am a lawyer, but I'm a personal injury lawyer. So if I'm going to help you, I should probably look up this law. And he looked and he looked and he looked, and he brought the law to the judge and said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I'm sort of new to this, but based on what is written here, this was a private event that was happening behind closed doors. I don't think a crime has been committed. The judge agreed with him. And suddenly he had all of the prostitution cases in Rhode Island, and it became, national news, and it sort of became known that you won't be arrested for engaging in indoor private prostitution in Rhode Island from 2003 to 2009. And during that time, gonorrhea rates dropped 40%, and reported rates dropped more than 30%. So,
Jesus.
yeah,
30%.
Overwhelmingly persuasively positive results from simply not arresting people for engaging in adult consensual prostitution.
Wow. That's
really
phenomenal.
Amazing things are possible. When you stop arresting people for engaging in sex work, you allow victims of violent crime to report. It really does a lot to improve the health and safety of communities, not just the immediate lived experience of sex workers, right? Who obviously are safer and healthier, enjoying more rights, but also the communities that they're in, right? You stop the disruption of incarceration, and you increase the negotiating power of people to push back against abusive or exploitative employers, domestic partners, and clients.
I mean, it's almost like in the criminalization of sex work, we have created the perfect environment for exploitation to persist.
Yeah.
Pimps, for example, are a creation of criminalization. Right? Before the criminalization of prostitution, which doesn't happen in this country until the 19th century, right? We criminalized prostitution, abortion, alcohol, and pornography all around the same time during the so-called progressive era. And so, and all of these laws were passed in the name of protecting women. right? And it actually made it harder for women to travel alone, right? Because they were seen as more vulnerable. And we specifically, during World War I, criminalized not just prostitution, but also promiscuity. And so this enabled police officers to stop any woman that he suspected of being promiscuous, whatever that means to him, and subject them to these horrible, invasive, unsanitary exams, right? And of course, this is decades before we have accurate STI tests or effective treatment, which we don't get until the 1940s with the invention of penicillin. And so it's literally just, chauvinistic doctors deciding that some poor woman is like looking too slutty in public, and then handing her off to some misogynistic doctor that was trained in medical school that only women are vectors of disease. Yeah. And then, if that woman was showing symptoms or gave either of those guys the wrong attitude, then she could be sent to a lock hospital or treated with mercury or arsenic or put on a list that made it impossible for her to find other employment or get married. So really, really horrific. There's a really, really horrific history here around not, criminalizing, containing, and controlling all kinds of women, not only people who engage in sex work. And I think that's really important for advocates to understand, right? That, we might pass laws where we say, well, no one should do this work, right? We want to make it really hard for people to do this work. And so if we think that you're doing this work, then we're going to seize your bank account. We're going to make it impossible for you to post online. We're going to take your children away. We'll evict you from your home. But all of those things can be done to somebody perceived to be a sex worker. And how many women have been called a whore by just someone that was upset with them for speaking, for having the wrong opinion, for wearing something? I mean, you guys come from an evangelical background, so you know how loose that definition actually is.
Wow. I mean, that's just all of that is so fascinating and also so heartbreaking. And so I have so many different tangential thoughts wrapped in one, but it's the amount of rage that I feel. And it's this is why women are angry, and this is why women should be angry. Anger is the correct response, first of all. And then second, I've been kind of going on a bit of a rabbit hole the last year or so and learning about the history of witches. And
so relevant.
It's so relevant, and it's so a part of feminist and women's history. And I see so much intersection with how women have been, men, frankly, I think they are afraid of women having power. So they try to strip that power so that they can control women in any way possible. Yes. And back when, however long ago, 1800s, whatever, making it up, it's well, if you're a witch, we're just going to drown you. And if you...
1700s.
Yeah. 1700s.
Yes, and
you
were so close.
Thank you so much.
The 1800s were you're diseased, but we're going to drown you. Same treatment. We're just calling it a different thing. Yeah, demonized to disease. Yeah.
And it's demonized to disease. There we go. Yeah. I like that. I like that phrasing because I feel we see that repeated multiple times throughout history. But it's well, if you float, you were a witch and it was a good thing we killed you. And if you don't float, then at least you weren't a witch. And I'm first of all, how dare you? I feel such a rage as you're explaining all this. And I'm I feel I'm seeing the Matrix, the feminist Matrix is really what's happening.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting because, as I'm sure going down this rabbit hole, so much of the witch hunts were about stripping women of their property rights, right? They targeted, women in brewing, women in beer brewing, right? Women that had been active members of guilds for thousands and thousands of years suddenly find themselves cut out, specifically targeting midwives and people that hold this sacred life, death, life cycle energy, right? About bringing people into the world and helping people exit. And that is so deeply entwined to the sacred whore narrative, right? The, priestess prostitutes coming out of the, ancient temples of Ishtar. Yes, of course, they're providing sacred sexual services, but they're also the keepers of knowledge around fertility and contraception and end of life care. Like all of this is being sort of held within the ancient temple. And of course, brothels, churches, theaters, hospitals, civic centers, all share this common ancestor. And the fact that we've tried to literally kick women out of the temple that we built. Yeah. And the war on, witches during the, early modern period, and the war on midwives during the white slave panic here in the US is also deeply connected to the demonization of whores during both of those kind of, moral panics around the status of women and women having too much control over their own bodies, and horror of horrors, actually the ability to make money and live just fine in the world outside of the governance of some dude, which has always been the existential threat to patriarchy.
Yes. Yes. And actually, I can't let this moment slip by without asking a unprepared question. But I hear this narrative a lot of like, oh, well, there's not that much money to be made in porn, or, oh, there's not that much money to be made. Like people, I feel like
Absolutely.
I hear this all the time. And it's that like, oh, well, she's going to quote unquote ruin herself for a couple bucks, but really she could go get a job and make just as much, if not more money, probably more money. Right. And so I'm really curious around this money question, right?
Sure.
Because everyone's like, oh, well, it's not worth your time. Like every girl has an OnlyFans.
I will absolutely say that sex work is fundamentally a sales job. And that you are, in like any sales job, or the overwhelming majority of sales jobs, right? The seller wants to sell more than the buyer wants to buy. And so it's so interesting to me because that really runs counter to the like sort of end demand prohibitionist narrative that, the market is driven by these, uncontrollably lustful men that, are sucking up the sexual energy of any woman that they come across. But really, people are trying to get their survival needs met. So yeah, there are a lot of models on OnlyFans. Yes, there are a lot of people trying to make ends, trying to get their ends met. That's the phrase. There are lots of people who are trying to get their survival needs met with sex work. And in sex work, like any other economy, is deeply stratified, right? There's absolutely, a hierarchy, or some people call it sort of like a hierarchy. And so privilege is reflected in sex work. And the more power, social capital, natural beauty, social connections, negotiating power that you have, that's going to be reflected in your work experience. And that's as true for waiting tables as it is for doing sex work, right? So, there are, just to take food and bev, which is, the service industry that I think people are more familiar with, you have sommeliers and executive chefs and people with television shows. And you also have, people that are bussing tables and their boss is holding their passport, threatening to have them deported. There's absolutely exploitation within the food and bev industry. And there's lots of people who are working really hard to barely make ends meet.
Yeah.
And I think that like the economy around sex work is really interesting because the stigma of sex work can make it harder to find other jobs, right? Especially with facial recognition technology and like, the fact that your face is out there. It can isolate you socially. And there's this constant churn of financial precarity, not just because sex work is unreliable income, but also because your bank accounts and payment platforms and technology platforms are seized all of the time because you are engaged in this stigmatized work, even if that work is legal. So, there are winners in this economy. There are people who are treading water, and sex work is one of many streams of income. And if any one of them went away, they would be in a really rough situation. And there are people that do this work that don't get their survival needs met, that are struggling.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important for us to talk about the real villain here, which is poverty.
Yes.
It's not prostitution. It's not pornography. That's not the problem in this story. The problem is that people do not have enough money to get their needs met. And we live in a society that does not take care of people.
I think that's so important because it's a job, right? It's a job just like any other job. And there are outcomes just like every other field in our economy. And there are the same, like you mentioned, power structures and privilege. And there's so much that plays into it. So that totally makes sense, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's not a one answer or a one size fits all. It's kind of everything.
I would also argue that sort of like any other job or profession, this isn't for everyone. There are people that thrive in sex work. There are people that love their job. There are people that want to do this work, that feel called to this work in the way that people are called to ministry or healing work. And also, there are lots of people that hate their job. Like the overwhelming, I was a terrible waitress. I should not have been waiting tables. I was very bad at it. And the people did not enjoy the services that I was providing because I was terrible at my job. I should not do waitressing. And there are people out there that thrive, that are fantastic at both the computer system and also engaging strangers in conversations about their dinner rules. Like that's awesome. And there are lots of people that just do that work in order to get themselves through school or to pay their rent or to, pay for their kids. The same spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion exists in sex work as exists in any other economy. I was a very bad waitress. I could never imagine myself working at a slaughterhouse or being a soldier or even being a police officer. That work is not for me. I could not do it, would not do it, should not do it. But just because that work is not for me does not mean that I need to denigrate that work or spend my one and precious life trying to criminalize it or shut down those avenues for other people. Although I do think that we should be getting military recruitment officers out of our schools.
Yes.
Yep.
You want to talk
a
about
mic drop
predatory.
right there.
Anyways.
But I think that that's a really, really valuable point that I think a lot of people miss, and a lot of people will use that as a reason for the criminalization of sex work is this idea that, well, this person had a bad experience or this person had an exploitative experience or whatever. We don't shut down entire industries because someone had a bad experience or because someone didn't enjoy the job. That's just not a reason that we use for any other profession.
Yep.
But we use it for sex work because it's something that people are already looking for reasons to shut down.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important that this is sort of being sold as a way of protecting people from making choices that they would later regret. This is the same reasoning that was used to criminalize abortion the first time. Right? Yep. It's the same reasoning that's being used to criminalize abortion now. And we can kind of primrose path walk ourselves into fighting for women to have fewer choices about how they live their lives. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that sex work throughout history has given women the opportunity to leave abusive relationships, to make their own money, to start businesses hundreds and hundreds of years before women won property rights or the right to vote in this country. And sex work continues to fund more students, artists, and entrepreneurs than all of the grants. And we can want that to be different, right? I don't believe that anyone should have to engage in work that is bad for them physically, psychologically, or spiritually. And I have seen people lose their soul at law firms because of debt slavery, right? At restaurants because of abusive management. There are so many ways to waste your life, and sex work is no exception. There are lots of paths to unhappiness. Yeah. But to cut off this avenue that has given so many people a way out of poverty or a way out of a bad situation, it's a lot of things, but it's not helping.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I keep thinking about how it's the same argument that's being used to prevent trans people from getting gender affirming care. Let's pull out the one or two people that had a bad experience and
highlight the 0.01% of detransitioners or something like that, and then say that's everyone's experience.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that gender affirming care has like a lower regret rate than like knee surgery.
I think it's 92% of people do not regret transitioning medically. It's something like that. It's in the 90s. It might be 92. Fact check that. But it is a very high percentage, which is very successful in the medical industry.
Yeah.
Like, think about women who were born women at birth who get breast implants, who regret them 20 years later. That is also gender affirming care.
Correct.
But it's just the gender that you happen to have been assigned at birth. And anyways, we could go down a whole tangent.
Like a whole nother,
I'm like,
it's deeply related. I mean, I want to give a lot of credit. Like, trans folks, I think, have really moved the conversation forward, both in terms of like feminism and also with sex work, right? We have a lot of heroes in the sex worker rights movement that, you know, I've lived experience as trans folks, and our issues are deeply intertwined, right? It's a lot about, you know, bodily autonomy, making choices that are, you know, outside of the mainstream. And of course, trans folks are overrepresented in sex work because of transphobia.
So good. Well, thank you so much for going down the rabbit hole with me. There were so many great little nuggets in there, and I'm like, wowza. But I'm really curious, Kaytlin. Some people really claim that the U.S. culture is hypersexualized. You touched on this earlier. Sure. But while others really claim that the culture is actually very prudish. So as a former sex worker, what is your take on American culture, the level of sexualization?
It's such an interesting question. I mean, the answer is obviously both, right? Like, we live in a very sexualized, but also a very like commodified culture. And I think like the commodification of sex and erotic energy is everywhere, even though sex work is so stigmatized and criminalized. Sure. And so I think like a lot of what people are reacting to when they, you know, are trying to demonize sex work is this culture that commodifies sexuality and then strips women of their advocacy or ability to access like authentic pleasure. Because we actually live in a very sex negative culture when it comes to women enjoying themselves.
Yeah.
And so that I think is a really, really important conversation for us to have, and looking at the history of how women's pleasure came to be demonized and then diseased. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that, you know, doctors had convinced most white people that like one of the worst things that you could do as a parent was let your kid masturbate. I mean, we sold penis vice grips. We encouraged parents to put carbonic acid on their child's clitoris, all to prevent, you know, self-harm. You know, it wasn't that long ago that like, you know, John Harvey Kellogg invented his Kellogg's cornflakes as a safer, kinder way to prevent a child's natural instinct to self-pleasure. And a lot of smart people throughout history seem to genuinely believe that people enjoying themselves by themselves is like the problem with society, right? Yeah. It's not war, it's not slavery, it's not exploitation, it's not the fact that women don't have property rights, right? It's that it's too easy to buy a titillating novel. You know? And I think that conversation has been going on for a really, really long time. And what we have done to these sort of like natural, sacred impulses is horrific. And like some of it is commodification, some of it is demonization, some of it is, you know, pathologizing, but sex work did not invent these problems. We are operating within them.
One wild one that I just recently heard was that if you masturbate, then pubic hair will grow on your hand.
Oh, that's an old one. Yeah.
Yeah. I had never heard that before, but I was like, this is the wildest thing I've ever heard. And I know people who didn't even know that they could masturbate as women until they were in their 40s. And had spent all this time having children, having husbands.
Not knowing what their own vulvas look like.
Yes. Never knowing how to self-pleasure. And like, that is wild to me. And it's part of that suppression of knowledge and access to information for women. Absolutely. And the suppression of female pleasure while male pleasure is totally fine.
And we justified so much of that because if women were allowed to know how to access their own pleasure. If women were allowed to own their own pleasure, well, they might become whores, right? That's always been the justification, right? Is that we want to protect women from their own desire. We want to protect women from knowing too much about themselves because they might, right, go out and take something that makes us uncomfortable.
Wow. Well, as a church kid, like I believed that masturbation, porn, anything sexual until marriage would fundamentally alter your brain chemistry, that it could cause you to become a creep. Like you could become gay. Worst case scenario, you know? Like, like there were so many things that were taught to me about engaging in sex at a young age, which I mean, maybe not in sex, but in
anything
pleasure,
sexual,
masturbation, that would, you know, kind of ruin you forever. Which
one of the funniest myths that I heard was that like masturbating or like magically engaging in premarital sex would like change the shape of your vulva, right? Like you're like would like stretch out, like just the magic power of like penis and pleasure or something. And I was like, but childbirth is fine. Like I don't know, so who's compared the penises to babies, because that's
right.
Quite a big size difference there.
Stretched out, and then your husband won't want you.
Right, exactly. And that was a big part of the, like, you know, when they were checking women for promiscuity, right? Like these are the kinds of beliefs that informed those kinds of exams. Right.
Wow.
Yeah, like what you were talking about before is getting underneath the foundational beliefs or the foundational reasons behind demonizing women's pleasure. So I think that's like one of the more broken things in our society, right? It's not like how much sex, right? But it's like, is everyone enjoying that sex? I was raised Catholic once removed. So, you know, my parents did the baptism dress and we got the pictures, but then very sporadic church. But I married into an evangelical family, and I came up in George W. Bush's abstinence-only education program. So I got quite a bit of evangelical sexual philosophy in my public school, which is something we're still unpacking.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, but this idea that, you know, if you do a good enough job of preventing yourself from accessing pleasure or learning about sex or experimenting, then and only then will God bless you with this like magical, incredible, fantastical sex experience with your betrothed, right? That you're supposed to like prevent. And then magically on the night of your wedding, this gift of sacred knowledge or whatever is just, and I just can't imagine how frustrating that must be, because that can't be the lived experience of most.
Well, and that's a great segue.
And it's not actually, as someone who played by the rules.
It actually doesn't work that way. I
can tell you. I'm like, you know what, babes? Like, go buy yourself a sex toy, go get a vibrator, figure it out now, because your marriage will not help you with that. Well, okay, maybe you have a supportive partner and all the things, but like it has to start with you.
Anyway, also, you're losing your virginity on your wedding night is not going to make the heavens open and angels sing from above as you experience the most pleasurable thing of your entire life.
And as someone that did that, I can pinky swear that's not how it works. But
I'm so sorry.
Thank you so much. It's great. We're getting into somatic work and all the things. So we're figuring it out. But on that note, I feel like we can't be talking about purity culture and, you know, sex education and demonization of women's pleasure and all those things without addressing the ever-present Christian church. So can you please share a little bit about how the historical intersection of the Christian church and sex work looks like? Because it's vast.
Yes. Yeah, it's vast. And I think it's really important to say right up front that like I am not a biblical scholar. And this is not my religion, but I have felt forced to study this, frankly. And so the early Christian church comes out of the Roman Empire, which is one of the most misogynistic, patriarchal empires the world has ever seen. And so much of what I have come to loathe about the so-called Christian faith has come from the Roman Empire's commitment to male dominance and patriarchy, and less about the actual teachings of Jesus, who seemed pretty cool. Jesus was chill with sex workers, seemed to share power and credit with Mary Magdalene, who was not a sex worker, but was maligned by the early Christian church, specifically Pope Greg in 591, when he, during what I can only assume was a drunken Easter sermon, called Mary Magdalene a sinful woman because he mixed her up with one of the other Marys in the Bible. And so the Christian church ended up creating an institution that was more committed to stripping women of their property rights and hunting homosexuals than it was to spreading the good news about infinite forgiveness. Yeah. And so, sex workers are present in the Bible. A lot of them do some pretty cool things. There's a lot of really great stories about sex workers, creating opportunities. They're great strategists. So many of the women that have been maligned as sex workers in the Bible, right? Like Mary Magdalene, like Jezebel, were not sex workers. But these archetypes and these myths have been used to, create an institution that really would not let women preach. I mean, we've killed women for being ministers, right?
Yeah.
Even though the hands down most successful Christian missionary in the history of the Christian church was undoubtedly Mary Magdalene. We do not have, she's the first Christian, right? She's the first witness to the resurrection. She's the only one of Jesus's followers who stayed for the entire crucifixion. She spends the rest of her life, right, spreading his gospel everywhere that she goes. And we somehow created an institution that didn't let women talk and still won't let women hold leadership positions. It's bananas. And so much of it is grounded in whorephobia, right? All it took to demote Mary Magdalene from one of the most important early Christian apostles was that some dude called her a whore from the pulpit 500 years later. That's all it took.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the whorephobia is so powerful. That you can derail so much and very progressive thought that's taught in the New Testament of the Bible by Jesus, even some by other writers of the New Testament that are inclusive of women, that are lifting up women who lead churches and who are serving the poor, who are spreading this message of acceptance. And if you say, oh, actually, this woman was a sex worker, or minimizing the ways that women have had this really big impact in a hyper-patriarchal society, it's allowed millennia of excluding and oppressing women with this same religious doctrine.
Yep.
Which is wild.
Well, and that just brings me to, I read an article on your site, Old Prose Online, plug, about Mike Bickle and the Sound of Freedom. And I think we continually see across the board when it comes to moral promiscuity or sexual impropriety, we're dealing with men who are in power and have unfettered access and unfettered ability to do whatever they want and manipulate whoever they want in very horrific ways.
And it doesn't seem like an accident to me that so much energy has been, exerted trying to get women to talk about that less, right? I think...
Oh, God.
I don't remember where I read this, but I believe the early Christian church sort of acknowledged that for men, lust was the worst sin. But for women, it was gossip. And I really just can't help but wonder if maybe it was gossip about what the men were doing to them for this whole time.
Yes, exactly. I literally just wrote a piece about this, how if the church can keep you ashamed, they can keep you quiet.
Correct.
And this shame tool is something that has been used for literally hundreds and hundreds of years to control women. Yeah. And I'm like, WTF, sit down.
Yeah. And gossip is a tool to spread information and keep women safe.
It's a harm reduction tool. Absolutely.
Yes.
And I mean, if you know, again, not a biblical scholar, haven't spent a lot of time with the script, but you know, if you're looking at the laundry list of things that Jesus cared about, lust and gossip aren't on there. He cares about things like greed, exploitation, violence, not being kind, not loving your neighbor, right? But like that would be a threat to patriarchal capitalistic control. Like, you know, like, you know, maybe you're exploiting your workers and you're beating your wife and kids, but you know, what, you're keeping it in your pants or you're not, but people aren't talking about it. Like,
you're keeping it secret. Yeah. You're being discreet.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that makes you a respectable man in Christian society.
Great. Woohoo.
Yeah. No, the story of Tim Ballard and what's you know, what happened with Operation Underground Railroad and Sound of Freedom. I think it's really important to elevate these stories because there's so many people out there claiming to speak for sex workers, right? Claiming to be working to, you know, end exploitation or end trafficking that are, you know, not only not helping, but are actually doing real harm.
Yeah.
And this narrative that we have around the, you know, the white slave panic or the trafficking panic that we have now, it really does a lot to hide the very real, often violent sexual exploitation that is happening in our homes, is happening in our churches, is happening in our institutions. And we make believe that it's an out there problem, right? It's a queer problem. It's an immigrant problem. It's a porn problem because we are unable or unwilling to look at what's happening in our own homes.
Yes. Oh my God. So good. So I think that's actually a good segue because there's a huge problem with what the mainstream narrative is in America today about sex work, about sex, and with the actual data and what is actually happening. I even think of like most education about porn and most of what we understand about porn, like even on Psychology Today and, you know, health websites is funded by evangelical organizations that have a very specific motive, and that's very problematic. Big problem. What do you think then in the midst of that are the most dangerous misconceptions about sex work that you come up against?
I think the foundational problem is that porn and prostitution have become symbols of violence against women and exploitation. And I think that if we all took a step back, we could see that the problem is exploitation, and we could widen our lens to see that exploitation in all of the places that it manifests, because it's just as gross to violently coerce somebody into, you know, working in a field for no money, or working in a toxic mine or with toxic chemicals, or to force people to clean houses for, you know, pennies on the dollar or no money. There are absolutely very real examples of violent exploitation, right? There is literal slavery in this country, to say nothing of what we do to prisoners. However, when we redirect that energy towards trying to suppress or censor or eradicate all forms of erotic expression, we are not helping a single victim. We are not preventing a single incident of sex slavery or violence or exploitation. We are not saving a single kid from being, violently exploited by a predator. Instead, we are making it harder for people in the sex industry to share information with one another, to keep ourselves safe, and to report the violent predators that actually do exist. Because if you conflate purchasing sexual services, right, a reasonable client paying money for sexual services, with violent predators, then you make it impossible for us to find the actual predators.
Totally. You're muddying the waters,
right,
of who is truly going to be the exploiter of people. Like, if everyone is.
Yes, then no one is. And so a society that does not allow people, especially women, to say yes is also a society that doesn't allow them to say no. Mm-hmm. So if I say I am an adult and I consented to be a sex worker and I am met with, no, that was paid rape. Well, then what is my rape though? Right? If I am not the decider on what was or what was not a violation of my body, then who is?
We've actually talked about this, especially as it pertains to purity culture as well, and the mandate to not have sex prior to marriage is it essentially eradicates consent from the conversation, because as a, probably mostly brainwashed young kid, you are only allowed to say no. And so if you say no against your internal yes, that's a violation of self in a different way. And if you say yes, you are violating this sort of religious quota that's been placed on your sex life.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't actually allow teenagers to understand their own personal autonomy in their sex lives, which is very dangerous. It doesn't
allow them to feel and exert the difference between their authentic yes and their authentic no.
Yes.
And then it obliterates the ability to say no as a married woman.
Exactly. Right? Because there's the messaging that a woman should provide sex to her husband at any time that he so desires. And because that internal gut, that reading of your own gut and your own desires has been eliminated through so much conditioning, there's no way. There's no way to say yes enthusiastically.
Well, and this is even outside of coercive, abusive, mean husbands. I think there are evangelical women everywhere with very loving, thoughtful husbands in heterosexual marriages that don't feel like they can say no.
Yeah, totally. Yes, it's not just the super bad cases, quote unquote, or it is across the board because this messaging doesn't allow for it. Full stop.
Yeah.
And you've already created somebody at that point that is so disconnected from their own authentic experience of pleasure, because that's always been a sin. It's always been a violation.
Yeah.
So how can you ask somebody to tap into that within a loving relationship? Yeah, it's a really self-defeating philosophy.
Yeah. And I'm curious, but as we're talking sort of about evangelicals and all the ways that they are against sex work, we've danced around it and we've touched on it a little bit, but the big argument that I always hear is that sex trafficking and sex work cannot be separated, essentially. These things go hand in hand. That is the argument as to why the guy that did The Sound of Freedom did it. That's the argument behind why so many Christians want to eliminate sex work in all forms, because they think it inherently is going to create and fuel the market for sex trafficking. So I'm curious to hear from you, what does that intersection actually look like?
Sure.
And how do you negotiate that as a former sex worker and an advocate in this space?
Yeah, the underlying assumption behind that argument is that nobody would consent to this work. Right. That there's nobody in their right mind that would ever just do porn or do prostitution because they want to. And I exist.
Yes.
And so, I've had the great privilege of knowing and becoming friends with all kinds of sex workers, right, across generations that, not only chose to do this work, but felt called to this work. But that is not the only experience of sex work. There are absolutely people who choose to do this work because it's the fastest or most available way of getting their needs met, right? There are a lot of single moms that do this work because it allows them to spend more time with their family. Do they love this work? No, but they would rather have the flexibility and the income that this generates. And as I've mentioned before, like so many labor sectors, there's absolutely examples of violent coercion within sex work. There are people in domestic violence situations who are bullied and violently coerced by their partner to doing this work. There are networks that leverage, purity culture and all of these assumptions around women and sexuality to sort of rope young, naive women into becoming sex workers, right? With the narrative that like, well, you're ruined now, right? Which is a narrative that the Catholic Church used to become the largest brothel owner in Europe for 400 years. So it's an old story. And so I think that, it's really important to drill down into what it is that we're actually talking about, because when everything is sex trafficking, then nothing is sex trafficking, right? I'll take a like low-hanging fruit example. What priests were doing in the Catholic Church for years and years and years with the widespread, well-known, well-documented sexual exploitation of young people, right? That's gross. That feels like sex trafficking to me.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Epstein and what he was doing with, coercing and luring vulnerable young girls, as young as like 12 and 14 into engaging in sexual services and then, using that to amass power. That feels like sex trafficking to me.
Yeah.
But compare that with like, for example, the story of Robert Kraft. I don't know if you guys saw this in the news. Robert Kraft, kind of a bumbling billionaire, owns the Patriots, which I think is a very popular football team.
Yeah.
And he got caught in a John sting in South Florida where, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and 3 different local law enforcement agencies all did coordinated stings on like 12 different massage parlors that were, providing sexual services. Robert Kraft is a 70-year-old widower who paid a 45-year-old legally licensed masseur to give him an enthusiastically consensual handjob. That is like, that's not sex trafficking. I don't even think that should be a crime. Certainly the Department of Homeland Security feels like a stretch.
Yes.
And so, when we conflate prostitution, pornography, erotic expression, women enjoying themselves with exploitation, we justify all of these banana pants laws that end up stripping women of their freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom to associate, or the ability to keep their own money in bank accounts. But when we ignore sexual exploitation in our own institutions, right? Whether it's the Catholic Church or the Mormon Church, like,
everywhere.
There's so many
All
examples of
churches,
that.
probably.
Yes.
What Tim Ballard was doing feels wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're muddying the conversation. There is a line between sex work and sex trafficking, and it is the same difference between farming and slavery. We can see the difference here. And the solution to slavery was not to outlaw farming. That's not the cause.
Right.
There are absolutely things that we can do to improve the negotiating power of victims across the board. Universal health care, childcare, housing, getting people's basic needs met. These are all anti-trafficking initiatives, right? Because they make people's basic survival needs more accessible. Vulnerable people are exploitable. Policies that create more vulnerable people lead to more exploitation, right? Separating children from their parents at the border created a massive sex trafficking incident of border patrol officers and police officers exploiting, often sexually, the people that were charged in their care, right? People are not crossing this border in order to kidnap your daughter from soccer and sell her into sex slavery. That is not happening. People who are in vulnerable positions are exploited in all kinds of horrific ways, including sexually. That is happening in your community right now.
And I think that's really helpful because, especially as someone from an evangelical background, the only thing I've ever heard about porn or sex work is not positive and is very much this sort of like twisted feminism in terms of like, these people are being taken advantage of and we have to stop these terrible lustful men from going after them and whatever, which is not great.
Yeah.
not
And
great.
it removes the agency that women have.
Yes.
And the idea that a woman could choose something, such as sex work, and the idea that, like, either this woman is helpless, has no personal agency, and is being objectified by men, or this woman is twisted somehow to have chosen
broken
this lustful sexual Jezebel path.
We all think that every prostitute, every sex worker is Fantine from Les Miserables, who has been, like, put into this such a terrible life position that she must sell her body.
Yeah. And even in that story, the culprit is poverty.
Yes.
Right? Like, sex work is a tool that she used to keep her child alive when the job and the selling of her hair and the selling of her personal possessions wasn't enough for her to pay that bill. Yeah.
Okay. Oh my God. This has been such an enlightening conversation. I think you're just so well spoken and so intelligent, and you've clearly done a lot of work and a lot of research in this area. So thank you so much for educating us and educating our listeners. I think especially coming out of this evangelical perspective, it's so scary to look into these fringe topics. And I think diving into the actual fundamentals of how these things work and the perspectives of the people who are actually affected by it is so valuable. So thank you so much for sharing. I wanted to ask you our age-old question. It's a question we have for every guest, and it's open to interpretation. And that is, what does woman being mean to you?
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast, for being willing to look at this topic, because I know that it can be scary for all kinds of folks. So I really, really appreciate that. And I've been thinking about this question for a while. Thank you so much for sending it in advance. And I keep coming back to something that I was told very early in my sex work career by an older sex worker, who said, always listen to your gut. You can do all of the screening, all of the whatever, but when you walk into a room or when you get on the phone with a client or when you're walking down the street, listen to your body, because it is telling you something, and it's trying to keep you alive. And that advice has served me well. It's served generations of sex workers well. And I think so much of the misogyny and paternalism and the patriarchy and just how much ancient, sacred, powerful knowledge has been stripped from generations of women when it's all right there. Listen to your body and trust yourself. And that's what woman being means to me. Reconnecting with that.
Yeah, that one gave me some good goosebumps.
That has been, I think that will be my lifelong work, is learning to listen to myself, especially with the amount of sort of conditioning that you come out of when stepping away from evangelicalism, is figuring out, okay, what's happening inside of me, the person, and what is my gut instinct, and how am I gonna navigate this situation or this life. So anyways, that's very good. Always need to be reminded of that. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to share any resources.
Sure.
With our listeners, in terms of if they're really fascinated by this topic, where would you send them? And then also to plug away at all of your various amazing exploits.
Yeah, if you love this conversation and you want to hear more, we send out a newsletter every week from Old Pros. It's a roundup of sex worker rights related news, new podcasts, and of course, my upcoming tour dates. And you can sign up for all of that at oldprosonline.org. That's also where you can find our entire archive, over 150 episodes. We're going into season 6 now of the Oldest Profession podcast. So, scroll through our archive. There might be some names that you recognize. There might be a bunch of names that you don't. But every episode is a deep dive into a different sex worker from history or somebody who was maligned as a sex worker and why their story still matters today. I am currently touring my show, Whore's Eye View, a mad dash through 10,000 years of history from a sex worker's perspective. And you can find all of our tour dates at oldprosonline.org or whoreseyeview.com.
Amazing. And I will say your podcast genuinely is so much fun
so
and
good.
so educational
Thank you.
to listen to. I think the first one I listened to was the most recent one that you had posted, which was on the woman who was married to Winston Churchill's son.
Harriman.
Yeah.
Pamela
Churchill Harriman.
Yes. And
I love her story.
Yes, it's so good and such a wild ride. And as you learn about how she has influenced UK and US government and like has basically like pulled herself up by her bootstraps through her sex work and been able to do so much good.
Yes.
So anyways, that's just an additional plug is that you are going to learn something amazing. And Kaytlin is an incredible storyteller and like executor of this information. So I highly recommend.
Yes.
10 out of 10.
Ditto. Okay. All that being said, go check out oldprosonline.org. Go check out the Oldest Profession podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever
Caitlin.
you find your podcast.
Yes, literally
Wherever
follow
podcasts are
Kaytlin
sold.
everywhere.
Follow Kaytlin. She's on Instagram.
You can also follow us online at Old Pros Online.
Old Pros
Amazing.
Online. Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you again so much. You're so fun. And
Thank you.
we've been looking forward to this for so long. And so it really is like such a treat that we were able to meet with you. And without further ado, also don't forget that we are on Instagram, TikTok. You can follow us at Woman Being Podcast.
Yeah.
We also would very much appreciate if you would go give us a little review on your favorite podcast platform. Also, the Oldest Profession podcast, give them a review as well. And that's it. That's
Look out
all.
for the next episode.
Yeah. We'll see you in May.
Amazing.
Bye.
The end. That's the episode.